Welcome to the panel on cyber deterrence. I've written my own jokes today, so I'm going to try a few out on you just as sort of a warm-up. The first one is that I'm glad that lunch didn't deter you from coming here. Look, they'll get better, I promise. Anyway, I'm David Gio. I'm the history fellow here. Usually I wear elbow patches. Today I did not. And I have the honor of moderating this august group. And I'm thankful to Aaron Brantley for asking me to do this. And he said, Dave, I've put this panel together with, Joe Nye and Scott and Jackie. And he said, but it's just missing that something. He's like, I need some star power to make it pop. So he said, Dave, will you do it? And so I said, sure. So anyway, my students were actually so jealous of me getting to do this that some of them gave me questions in advance, and they're here today. So thank you guys for doing that. Obviously, the really insightful and probing questions are my own, and the ones, if they're overly simplistic and you think they're stupid, they're from my students. I told you the jokes would get better, right?
He's still joking?
Anyway, I'm actually not going to talk about deterrence at all because I definitely can't do it better than this crew. So that was my opening. You're welcome. What we're going to do is I've asked the panelists to present something, about 5 minutes each, and then I'll ask them a couple of questions just to kind of get the ball rolling. And then I'm going to really quickly turn it over to you guys because ultimately this is a panel for your benefit, not my own. We're LinkedIn friends, so I can talk to them anytime. So I'm going to give them the most basic of introductions. The full ones are on your app and online, so you can read them. We'll start on the left with Professor Joe Nye. He's the University Distinguished Service Professor Emeritus and the former Dean of Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. Aaron Brantley is Assistant Professor of Cyber Things at Virginia Tech, and he also remains a non-resident Cyber Policy Fellow here at the ACI and also with the Combating Terrorism Center at West Point. Captain Scott Jasper, U.S. Navy retired, is a faculty member in the National Security Affairs Department at the Naval Postgraduate School out in Monterey, California. And then finally, Jackie Schneider is an assistant professor in the Center for Naval Warfare, Center for Naval Warfare Studies, and a core faculty member at the Center for Cyber Conflict Studies at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. You'll notice that the amazing naval real estate is front and center, some great stuff. Really quickly, the panelists, those who have a U.S. government affiliation have asked me just to remind you that they're here in the capacity that what they present is their own opinion and their own analysis, and not necessarily that of the United States government, although it should be, right? It's not yet. Now that you've met our panelists, let me just give one brief observation to kick things off and kind of set the stage for our discussion. And so the first question then is going to go to Jackie, because I like her best. I've heard it said that regarding cyber capability, you know what? Let me let you do your opening first, and then I'll come back to you.
Okay.
Is that okay?
Yeah, sounds good.
All right, you go.
Well, I want to start by reading a quote. Yeah.
Is it of me?
I'll let you figure that out.
Okay.
This is, it cannot be defeated or discouraged by a single victory, and the patient persistency by which it is animated means that it cannot be effectively countered by sporadic acts, but only by intelligent, long-range policies. So that was written by George Kennan in 1947 about the Soviets. And it was the introduction to his discussion about containment and what some say was the last grand strategy of the United States. So today I'm supposed to talk about deterrence, and instead I'm going to talk to you about what I want to call the new strategy, which is cyber containment. And part of cyber containment is deterrence, but it also is other options. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that might look like for the United States. So the core of what Kennan was arguing was that there was something very special about the United States that needed to be contained against Soviet influence. And he articulated what these core desires and beliefs and interests were. That has generally been missing for a lot of our strategies in cyber. But I'm going to go out on a limb and say that the core of what we in the United States really care about in terms of cyber is the preservation of open and free internet and the ability to depend on digital technologies for our society, economy, and military power. So there's a lot of little s strategies within cyber containment. And the first is deterrence. And I'll spend most of my time talking about that since that's what our panel is on. So deterrence is supposed to protect the core of what we're going to contain. It doesn't protect everything that we care about. In fact, this is the biggest problem that I think we have with our current cyber deterrence policies. Our current cyber deterrence policies really ask for us to deter almost everything from everyone. And so far, that really hasn't been successful. So I'm going to advocate that our deterrence needs to be focused on 4 primary civilian infrastructure sectors and 1 military mission. So those 4 infrastructure sectors are energy, water, emergency services, and nuclear. And the reason why I picked these 4 infrastructure sectors out of the 16 plus elections that are currently identified by the Department of Homeland Security is that these particular infrastructure sectors, attacks on these will create cascading effects that can affect the entire economy. Also, because the network of how these sectors are put together are much more centralized than some of the other sectors currently identified, which means that there are core nodes that can be attacked that can make the entire sector vulnerable. So I mentioned there was 1 military mission that I believe should be in our core deterrence, and that is deterring threats against the nuclear command, control, and communications, the NC3. And I think that's something that is inviolable, and I would like to talk in the question and answer more about the potential for insecurity and instability based on planning for attacks against nuclear command and control. So those are the 5 targets that I think we should be focusing on deterring. So who should we be deterring? There's a wide set of actors out there in cyberspace. I believe that our deterrence capabilities should be focused on state actors. And they should be focused on the most capable state actors, which are North Korea, Russia, Iran, and China. Why? Why not the non-state actors, which make up the vast majority of attacks in cyberspace? Well, first, there's significant technical capability and capacity to conduct long-scale cyber campaigns or significant cyber campaigns that most non-state actors just don't have. So the most dangerous attacks are going to come from state actors. Also, state actors are more deterrable because we understand more about how they can be influenced, and we can use conventional means of deterrence by punishment in order to influence their cost calculus. Which leads me to how I think we should focus our deterrence. And I think we should focus on deterrence by punishment. And this goes actually counter to what the Defense Science Board just came out with. And I believe that deterrence by punishment will not be through cyber attacks. It has to be through cross-domain military operations. I say this because we've done analysis of 7 years of war games at the Naval War College, and what we find is that cheap talk and elaborate signals and difficult to understand capabilities don't work for deterrence. Instead, the things that work for deterrence are movements of hard, big machines and large conventional weaponry. So I think we need to focus on that. And if we care about less, then we can have credible deterrence by punishment options. So I think a lot of people, when they hear this, will be frustrated because I'm saying that we can't deter most of what is happening in cyberspace. But what I came here to talk about was an overarching strategy. And so that strategy includes other options outside of deterrence. And those options are defense and resiliency, counter-cyber operations, and norms. And I don't want to take too much time, so I'll wait till question and answer to discuss those more in detail. But I think it's time for us to think more about cyber in terms of larger strategy. And going back to how Kennan thought of the world and how Kennan thought about the way the US should use its military, economic, information, and diplomatic powers in order to shape and influence the international system, that's where we need to go.
Thank you, Jackie. We're going to skip Scott since he didn't buy my book, and we'll go to Aaron next.
It's the price to pay.
So what I want to talk about is the mind associated with deterrence. And I was reminded last night sitting at dinner with a former professor of mine about reading Bruce Bader-Mosquito's utility theory of international conflict. And the idea that you can deter someone starts with being able to think like they think and understand how they think, whether you're thinking at the lowest level or at the highest level, and there are multiple different things in between. And so in writing on this particular topic, And in looking at how we've deterred in other conventional domains, we've often tried to change perceptions or change associations of risk and reward associated with various types of things. And virtually every type of deterrence in some way tries to manipulate this cost-benefit analysis, whether it be through entanglement, self-manipulation by engaging with others, through denial, the elevation of cost in the antecedent period before you engage in a conflict, or the post hoc elevation of cost after a conflict has already been engaged in. And then we oftentimes in the military and intelligence communities conflate a lot of things such as criminological costs associated with engaging in sub-level acts of conflict as well. I'll save you the suspense, and I think that in general, there's already a relatively robust threshold of deterrence occurring within cyberspace. And I think the evidence quite robustly bears this out, that there's a line at which states really don't go above with other tier 1 states. So tier 1 states are fairly deterred from, say, taking down each other's nuclear power grids or energy grids or any other type of critical infrastructure. That doesn't mean that they won't do it within their own sphere of influence in states that they don't feel threatened by with a post hoc response, such as in Ukraine. Russia doesn't feel threatened by Ukraine if they take down their energy grid. But they would feel very threatened by our potential responses if they took down our grid. And so there's a threshold, and so we should start off by acknowledging that there is a threshold, and that threshold crosses almost all forms of conflict. The question is what about everything below that? Because all of that other stuff, as Joel Brenner and others have said, essentially equates to a death by 1,000 cuts. So how do we start thinking about deterrence in these particular realms of development? One, we can obviously increase costs both before and after conflict. We can do that by developing cyber mission forces, by showing that we are signaling that we're developing the potential for capabilities. We're not describing those capabilities, but we're signaling that we have the intellectual capacity to develop those capabilities. We can put in physical software, hardware, and other mechanisms that raises the denial costs associated with engaging in a particular act. But here's the problem. In almost all of these incidents, right now, it's a roughly 90-day window from the time of an attack to the discovery of that attack in most instances. And so that's in the best case, with the best organizations. Most organizations don't even discover their own vulnerabilities. Someone else points it out to them. And so this leads us into other types of understandings of how the mind works. And this gets beyond rationality into cognition and other types of behavior. So for instance, if I tell you you can rob a bank and you'll never get caught, would you do it? Yes. How many of you would not, other than some abstract moral reason or ethical reason, wouldn't rob a bank if you could walk away with $1 million or $2 million or $1 billion? Most of you would probably do it, okay? And that's not because you're bad people, it's because it's just money sitting there. If you find $1 billion sitting on the ground, you're gonna pick it up and walk away, okay? The same thing happens with criminals. And the other flip side is this. What if I tell you that you could walk away, but you'd be caught in 5 years? Well, that 5 years, you'd be flying around in Gulf Streams, you'd be having a great lifestyle. So how do we think about deterrence in these terms where we have problems such as risk-reward imbalances, where we have hyperbolic discounting, a term from economics, where we discount the risk associated with the reward in the short term? And how do we elevate these within the large-scale deterrence that Jackie's talking about? How do we elevate those so that we constrain this risk-reward balance for those actors that are really just giving us lots of paper cuts that really hurt?
Thank you, Aaron. Let's move over to Professor Nye.
Oh, thank you very much. The idea of discussing nuclear deterrence in 5 minutes is either daunting or deterring, but I'll just be daunted. I wrote an article in International Security published in February called Deterrence and Dissuasion in Cyberspace. And rather than try to cover all that in 5 minutes, what I'll do is just select a part of it. If deterrence, it means preventing by fear of consequences. In other words, you raise the cost for the attacker higher than the benefits that the attacker will get. Then, as we think about deterrence in cyberspace, the basic concept is the same as we use for other forms of deterrence, but it makes a huge difference about how we're doing it, who we're deterring and what we're deterring. Sometimes we act as though it's one generic thing. In fact, there's a table in my article that breaks this out. And if you say, how do we deter? In the Cold War and with nuclear deterrence, we rested very heavily on retaliation or punishment and denial, or the ability to protect ourselves, which is, after all, what the conventional forces of Europe were about, was deterrence by denial. Sometimes we think only about the nuclear component, but the conventional component is important. I would argue that in cyber, we have to add two more mechanisms to the how. And one of them is entanglement, and another is norms and taboos. I'm not going to explain all that, but I'm going to give you some examples. So how, there are four mechanisms, and very often we focus so much on one mechanism that we forget that the process, the political process, deterrence in cyber is quite complex, and you have to look at all four mechanisms. Let me agree with what Jackie said, which is, let's focus on the major state actors and state threats. It's not that you can't deter cyber criminals, but it's not the biggest part of the threat. So I will focus on Russia and China in particular. And John Lindsay has a famous statement in which he said, deterrence works in cyber for the major areas, like taking down the grid or something, that's it. But it doesn't work anywhere else. In other words, it works for big things, but then it's no good for much else. I'm not sure I agree with that. And in the article that I wrote, I distinguished between what I called laws of armed conflict, things that you want to deter, which is, let's say, taking down the grid, and where the American doctrine is kinetic equivalence. If somebody does something that does great damage to them, we'll reply, and we don't have to reply in domain. We can reply, as Jackie said, cross domain. And but the general view is that it's very hard to do what you might call sub-LOAC, those things that are below the laws of armed conflict. And a good example of a sub-LOAC is the Russian meddling in the 2016 election, which, if you look at Gerasimov's doctrine of 2013, is part of information warfare. And the Russians don't break this out into cyber and non-cyber. They break it out into information warfare. So when we're at the UNGGE with the Russians, they want to talk about what they call ICT, information and communications technology, not cyber alone. And their approach then is hybrid warfare and information warfare and cyber within that. The Matryoshka dolls are stacked differently for them. And the interesting question is, can we do anything about those sub-LOAC issues? And the general view, if you look at the 2016 experience, is that we were not able to deter it. Obama went to the G20 meeting and saw Putin and said, knock it off. We know what you're doing. Our intelligence is on to you. Quit it or else. And they thought that would deter Russians. It didn't. And then at about a month later, Jay Johnson, head of Homeland Security, and Jim Clapper made a public statement thinking that naming and shaming would deter the Russians. It didn't, as we now know. And then later, after the election, Obama talked about sanctions, but it's never clear how tough these sanctions were. Most people would say that this was a case of failed deterrence, that we weren't able to deter that sub-LOAC field. And from that, there's an argument that, well, that's true of the field as a whole. Cyber deterrence will only work, as Lindsay says, for the very big things, and all the rest, forget it. But I think there's another case which shows that you actually can deter sub-LOAC issues. And that's the agreement that was reached between Obama and Xi Jinping in 2015 to get the Chinese to change their practice of using cyber espionage for commercial purposes. Remember, the Chinese had said for years they didn't do it, and if they did it, they wouldn't acknowledge it, and on and on with denial after denial. Then the U.S. threatened China with sanctions in 2015, and what's more, the entanglement, meaning the extent to which the Chinese and U.S. economies were entangled with each other, was such that the expenses for China were going to be much higher than the benefits they were getting from the stolen intellectual property. And at that point, in the summer of 2015, Xi Jinping decided it was better with this summit coming up to agree to something they'd never agreed to before, and do a 180-degree reversal in Chinese declaratory policy and agree not to use cyber espionage for commercial purposes. And after that agreement, they didn't just leave it there in the dual relationship, or dyadic relationship. They took it to the group of 20 as to be adopted by the group of 20 major economies. So there was an instance of deterrence working. As Jackie pointed out, this was cross-domain. It was punishment. It worked partly by punishment, but also because there was entanglement. Not clear the same thing would work with Russia because there's so little entanglement at the economic level. So again, the point of these stories, and I'll shut up because I'm touching the edge of my 5 minutes if I haven't exceeded it. The point is that when we make propositions about deterrence, we've got to be more specific about how, who, and what, because one proposition is not going to cover everything.
Thank you, Joe. Scott, I'm still mad about the book thing, so I'd actually like to go back to Joe on this, because you raised the you raised the international security article, and I read half of it, and then I had some online training to take, so I skipped the other half. But
No, you put you to sleep.
No, I have a quote. You've written that the Russian hack of the DNC could be considered, quote, a failure of deterrence. But I think you sort of take away a little bit and you say, quote, but it was a relatively low threshold attack that was modest in its accomplishments and its overall effect on national security. And I wonder, given the political mess that we're in right now that has evolved since you, I'm sure, submitted it for publication probably in the late 80s and it just came out in 2017, given the timeliness of some of these things, do you want to revise some of that, maybe, in terms of the second and third order effects on our civic trust and some of those other things?
Oh, I think you're definitely right. I mean, at the time that I wrote that, what we've subsequently discovered was not available in an unclassified form, and I only had access to unclassified forms. So I think it has had a bigger effect than I thought at the time. And what's more, we've now added elections as a 17th critical sector. Yeah. It's a bit odd to have 17, but so it's and in some ways Putin was too clever by half. He prevented the guy he wanted from doing what he wanted, which was to accommodate the Russians. So in that sense, we didn't do very well, but Putin did less well than we thought at the time also.
Thank you. Okay, Scott, I'm all better.
All right, better now? Fantastic. So I was asked to give 5 minutes on what I thought was my biggest takeaway regarding deterrence in cyberspace, and that would be that we need active cyber defense. And the reason that I would make this proclamation is that current strategies, as you're hearing here on the stage, are, I believe, insufficient to deter the wide array of malicious actors operating in cyberspace. And that really alludes to what Jackie's saying. We have nation states, we have hacker groups, we have criminal organizations, and don't forget, we have terrorists, especially striving to affect our lifestyle through cyberspace. So you're hearing really three strategies, I should say, with a series of means. The first being retaliation, to use all necessary means in response to hostile acts. Those could include cyber ops, diplomatic engagements, economic sanctions, legal indictments, or even kinetic ops. The shortcomings of that strategy is the means that we've demonstrated are unconvincing. They have limited effects, and they don't necessarily demonstrate resolve in order to change the behavior of the adversary, the competitor. The second would be deterrence by denial. The intent, of course, to use protective measures to improve security of networks and systems. In that case, the shortcomings would be the ingenuity of our adversaries, the offense over the defense asymmetry, and also a high risk tolerance, both on behalf of the attacker to get caught, and also our defenders not to invest in cybersecurity measures. And finally, deterrence by entanglement. And I, of course, did read Joe Nice's article in detail because I agree wholeheartedly with his views on entanglement and appreciate and have cited those. And I also respect the efforts of the State Department to establish cooperative measures to restrain behavior in the space, especially state actors who would endorse or allow on their territory the use of malicious cyber activities. However, the problem there is we have competing interests, competing values, and we have different legal interpretations in the domain, how states see it's okay or not to use cyber for their own interest, as I stated there. And lastly, they can deny. They can deny because, again, they're using those hacker groups, that second set of actor, and claiming, of course, they didn't do it. So in response, I've offered the strategic option of active cyber defense. Now, this is not something I made up. This is in the 2011 DoD strategy for operating in cyberspace, and it is an inherent part of defensive cyber operations in our joint publications. It is defined as a synchronized real-time capability to discover, detect, analyze, and mitigate threats and vulnerabilities. It does enhance deterrence by encouraging restraint, by sharpening perceptions of cost and benefits of a cyber attack. So I will say, before the questions queued up to me, in my book, I did look at outside and inside the network. And I'd like to start then with outside the network. You might or might not know that states are entitled to use countermeasures in response to a breach of a national obligation owed by another state. The Talon Manual, which most likely many of you have read, will even articulate that those states can turn to a private firm, including foreign companies, to act on their behalf in this manner. The term hackback is different because that's when an individual uses those countermeasures without authorization on their own. In the United States, of course, that could be a violation of the CFAA because of unauthorized access. So after my evaluation, I have offered that we, the United States, should allow licensed private companies to conduct hackback, but only under supervision of appropriate authorities in limited circumstances, according to the exceptions to the CFAA. Now, ironically, about a week ago, you're probably aware that the Active Cyber Defense Certainty Act was introduced in Congress by 2 representatives. That is very similar to the statement that I just said because it limits activity to authorized individuals after notification to the FBI. So somewhat parallel in thinking. But I do recognize there's a lot of issues that are going outside the network. Attribution, escalation, intermediary effects, collateral damage, and so forth. So really, I've looked mostly at inside the network with my research, where active cyber defense using technology, automated cyber defenses, endpoint network sensing, threat detection and analytics, and autonomous countermeasures to interrupt the cyber kill chain, and to act at relevant speed as quick as the actor is themselves acting. The value in this is that automated cyber defenses detect, verify, and remediate malware without regard to the actors or their motivations. This is the idea of stop the act, not the actor, because at that moment in time, all you want to do is defeat the objectives of the attack. Well, if you're aware, Johns Hopkins Flight Physics Lab has embraced some elements of this in a concept they called integrated adaptive cyber defense. They're looking at 2 key areas: automate cyber defense, reduce time to detect, respond to cyber threats. Aaron had stated it takes months, 90 days, to detect an attack. How long do you think ransomware takes to encrypt the files on your computer? How about a minute or 2 at the most? You don't have 90 days. You got to defeat that actor as fast as he's attacking you. You also have to share threat information, the tactics, the malware, and so forth, in order to enable others to defend themselves. The second key area of this architecture. So the question is, do these technologies really work? Is this just something you hear about in various vendor papers and someone's trying to sell you this in the expo floor of RSA? Well, I want to find out. And I want to be able to tell you yes or no. And the way I decided to embark upon that journey is to create a reference architecture implementation project working with Johns Hopkins. And this will be a description of secure integration and automation functionality. And it starts with creating a use case under their technical assistance, under the sponsorship of the NSA and also DHS. And the intent of the use case is to basically bring together the integrated automated capabilities of Palo Alto Networks, a Silicon Valley-based company that has an habitual relationship with the Naval Postgraduate School that I represent, to defeat an attacker using evasion techniques in a scenario. And we're going to pick NotPetya, which is a ransomware scenario that I'd love to talk about later. We want to look at the kill chain, how do we defeat the actor at every step, and how do we do it in accordance with the functions of this architecture. In order to prove that, we're going to take it to Integrated Cyber, an event in April, and demonstrate it to the community of integrated active cyber defense, and be able to then promulgate that this project has merit, this project being a proof of concept. Because at the end of the day, is active defense technically capable of defeating these actors? That's the question. Because if it is active cyber defense, then it will deny the benefit of the attack to the actor, which is a key element of cyber deterrence. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Scott. As billed, Jackie gets the first question for the panel. Can we have cyber deterrence without norms? The norms, the rules of the road are so inchoate. I don't know how we can, are we putting the cart before the horse, I guess is my question here. Yeah. Do we need to figure out the rules first and then figure out how we play the game later?
So it's interesting that in the cyber world, any panel on deterrence, if you had a bingo card, you should also have the word norms, because it comes up all the time. And while that seems logical when we talk about cyber, that's not always been the case when we've talked about other types of deterrence. And in fact, the academic families that deal with norms are not necessarily the same people who deal with deterrence. But in cyberspace, it seems that we really feel that these two need to be connected. And I think going back to some of the nuclear work is somewhat helpful here. Because if you think about what the predominant norm when you think of nuclear use is, it's the nuclear taboo, which is the non-use of nuclear weapons. And when you delve into the nuclear taboo, there's a debate about whether this non-use of nuclear weapons is about a logic of appropriateness, we do things because we should, or whether it's a logic of consequences. We do things or don't do things because there are consequences to our actions. And I think there's still a pretty sizable debate about whether a nuclear taboo is because we shouldn't do it, appropriateness, or consequences. Now, if norms are connected to consequences, then norms and deterrence are very similar. But if norms are about appropriateness, then having some sort of norm about how we should appropriately behave in cyberspace should augment deterrence. Otherwise, it would be almost replications of each other if it really is about consequences. And I don't know what the answer is to that right now. I know that the State Department says that they have norms, and there's GGE norms, but we all know that real norms are how people behave. And what we're seeing in cyberspace, I think the closest thing I can think of to a norm is restraint as well. And I've done research with a professor, Sarah Krapps at Cornell, where we've done a big experiment of a representative sample of the United States, and what we find is there's actually a cyber fire break. So where there was a nuclear fire break and we didn't want to go nuclear, there's actually the opposite that happens in cyber, where cyberspace doesn't lead to retaliation. So there does seem to be some sort of norm of non-response so far to cyber operations and cyber attacks.
Thank you. That sort of leads into actually my question for Aaron. We say non-retaliation, but do we really know? And I think this gets to one of the hard parts with as a scholar of intelligence, classification, and particularly active cyber operations are so highly classified and sensitive, how can we as a panel, how can we be confident in the things that we're writing and the things that we're saying and our judgments? How do we know that when we don't really know what's going on at this other level of interstate interaction, because we do things and we don't want anybody to know about it, and the recipient might not want anybody to know for embarrassment or any host of other reasons. So if you could just kind of take a stab at that.
So I think that the attribution problem, first of all, is less substantial than people think it is. First of all, when you do something in cyberspace, you're inherently creating data. Whether you walk through a sensor field in this building or whether you carry a mobile phone, giving yourself geolocation points all around, whether you type something on Google or something, you're creating large data points. Whether you use a proxy to transit through multiple other countries in the process of engaging in a cyber attack, at some point along the way, you're creating an enormous amount of data. And I found this extremely helpful in counter-terror activities for tracking down jihadists and others who were using encrypted applications and stuff, because they become very secure in certain places and then they are really insecure in others. And then you use those to find and track it back. The other thing is that I think that you hit on another issue, is that sometimes it's not just about that we can't attribute, it's that we don't want to acknowledge that something happened. And that's a different problem, and I think that gets a little bit to what Vint Cerf was talking about yesterday about insurance and stuff. But the other big problem, and I think also goes to this idea of norms of behavior, is that we have fundamentally different norms than all of our adversaries in this space. To give you an example, or a couple examples really quickly, I worked for the National Democratic Institute as a senior program officer. I also worked for the International Republican Institute for Advancing Democracy. And both of those organizations work in more than 70 countries around the world promoting democracy development, political parties, rule of law, and other types of things. They're funded under the National Endowment for Democracy. They were set up during the Cold War by Ronald Reagan. And their entire intent is to promote the development of democracies like ours, liberal democracies. Well, Russia and other countries like China see this as inherently hostile. And they see this as manipulating their political processes. And so they think that, what we think is, helping facilitate human rights and all these other types of things is inherently hostile. And so they think that what they're doing in response to us is roughly the equivalent to what we did to them in a much more open fashion. On the flip side, I was in an Eastern European country talking with a large defense industrial base organization this summer, and we were talking about what they wanted from us as a military and what we could give them in response. And I said, well, we would really want you all to do is to stop having cyber criminals attack and steal billions of dollars. You're one of the top 5 theft countries in the world. And they said, oh, what do you mean? We're not hacking your government or anything. And I said, no. I said, we're seeing lots of traffic coming from your country that's specifically related to theft of our own citizens. You want us to give you supplies, weapons, training, et cetera, but at the same time, you're stealing from our citizens. How can we, square this circle? It doesn't make any sense. And they said, oh, well, that's just hooligans. Well, that's $13 to $15 billion worth of hooligans a year. That's not insubstantial. That's more than you're asking us to give you back. So, this is, so the norms, this disproportionate relationship between what we expect to do with others, what they expect from us, and how they interact within their own societies, those are things that until in cyberspace we come to reasonable ground on these particular areas, then things like attribution and others will become less substantial.
Thanks, Sam. I think I'm gonna have to get out a map to figure out where you were having a hard time. Let me go to Joe and for another map. This time in East Asia. We talked about China, and we on one hand we say, well, maybe this goes back to norms. All President Obama had to do was simply go ask, and hey, the commercial thing, can we just tamp that down? Okay, no problem. Maybe that works. On the other hand, the United States government indicted, I think, 5 members of the PLA unit, and obviously they're never going to, show up, in the Southern District of New York or wherever. That said, it was almost we wanted to get muscular, and then it was sort of laughed off as like, that's all you have. And so how do these things interplay with norms versus sanctions versus legal recourse?
Well, the norm Obama and Xi met at California in 2013. And we had been complaining to the Chinese for a long time about the theft of intellectual property. And the Chinese tried to more or less shrug it off. And then they got a sort of a blessing from heaven because that was the Snowden revelation. And that totally diverted attention. And Obama and Xi had agreed to set up a low-level working group. So that working group was in effect, and when we indicted the 5 PLA officials, the Chinese broke off the working group. So it looked like that we again failed. But what's interesting is that we kept going back on this idea that there should be a norm, not against espionage, since we did it, but against espionage for commercial purposes, which we didn't do, but which the Chinese did. And the Chinese didn't want to touch that, but when in the spring of 2015, we signed an executive order saying that we would, in fact, go after countries and people. And in the summer of 2015, the National Security Advisor went to Beijing and said, this summit is coming up, and let me tell you, we're really serious. And at that point, the Chinese sent somebody back here, and in the summer, we negotiated an agreement to create a new norm, which Obama and Xi signed at the end of September, which said we won't use cyber for commercial purposes. So that's a case where the threat of the first efforts at retaliation, the Chinese tried to shrug off. But we kept at it, and the threat of retaliation in the context of entanglement meant the Chinese decided better to accept this new norm. And my friends who watch this stuff closely, I don't have any privileged classified access on this, say, yes, Chinese behavior has changed. In other words, it's not as though you just sign a piece of paper and then go back to exactly what you're doing before, that there has been a change in their behavior.
I wonder what's enough. Was it former Director Mueller testifying a couple years ago who said that, maybe it was General Clapper who said that it was the largest transfer of wealth in human history in terms of the IP. So I guess, almost any back off would still be massive in a sense. What's your sense of that trend? Do you think this is cooled down for a little while, or do you think this is?
No, I think the Chinese. I think the Chinese will indeed. The change in behavior, I think, is likely to stay changed. There are ambiguous cases. If you go after something which belongs to Lockheed, but it is related to a defense system, the Chinese could say that's classic espionage because we're going. If we're going into Chinese systems, we would look for something which affects the quality of their high-performance aircraft. So you could say, we could debate about whether that's commercial or classic, preparing the battlefield defense. But on things which were clearly pure commercial, going after an automobile manufacturer and finding out what the next plan was for their technology in electric cars, and then stealing that and giving it to a Chinese company, that apparently has changed.
Right. Dmitry Apravovich here last year gave a keynote, and he talked about this exact thing in CrowdStrike's data, and they said that over the year from the Obama agreement until his speech, that they'd seen roughly a 90% drop in commercial-based espionage.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think Dimitri's, it's a good plug for last year. Dimitri's talk, I want to say, is still online.
It is, yes.
So it's a fantastic talk. Scott, can you sort of expand on this idea of active cyber defense and maybe help us understand if you're in the sort of governmental sphere, how does that look, versus how would active cyber look in the private sector?
Sure. What I'd like to start with, though, is trying to continue the lineage of discussion on the Russia scenario, because it leads to that. We kind of dropped off, as Joe was talking about, somewhere in around maybe January of after the Obama sanctions, but you probably are aware that Russia interfered in the French election, which the NSA alerted them to, and they already knew that, the French. So we didn't actually deter Russia from continuing to interfere in elections, the primary intent of those. And there's been other cases in the last couple of months as I look at the ransomware attacks that isn't really getting the attention it deserves. And that is, last week, you might be knowledgeable of the fact that the FBI supposedly has collected evidence to charge the hackers in the DNC, which are attributed to Fancy Bear ATP-28, the GRU. The same day, Ukraine accused that same group of basically what's called the Bad Rabbit attacks, the ransomware attacks in Ukraine that occurred a week ago. Those attacks are linked in their malware to the NotPetya attacks that occurred at the end of June. Those got about one night of play on the national channels. I was actually here in DC at the time and watched that on TV. Well, we could say, well, that's just activity in Ukraine. It doesn't really affect us in the United States. But if you're aware, in NotPetya, that's shut down, for example, Merck, the drug producer, who's producing hepatitis B vaccines. It also,
Now there's a shortage.
and they have a shortage. They're not producing that because their operations went offline. They're also not producing Gardasil, which, if you're a parent, is what you use to treat HPV, if I get that right. So there's a major effect of what Russia's been doing around the world. So we're not deterring them from malicious cyber activity by the means that we describe. And that's why, I'm pretty wed to the idea of using the automated defenses that I explain. And so my answer to you on the government, the Hopkins architecture was built in collaboration with National Security Agency, Integrated IAD, Information Assurance Directorate, thank you. And it is really meant for government agencies, such as Jackie's saying, and used by critical infrastructure, like water and nuclear and so forth. And of course, it could be of great benefit to commercial organizations such as Maersk and FedEx, who were hit hard, $3 million apiece in NotPetya. So the technologies, whether they are put in place in government systems, infrastructure, or major commercial providers of services, manufacturing, can work. And that's what I'm looking to prove.
Thanks, Scott. I grew up on Jerry Springer, so let me just ask if you guys want to come back to each other.
Yeah.
We don't have any bouncers, but but before we open it up, we'll give you guys the first whack at each other.
Can I just push Scott on the active defense, because I think it is very interesting. But if you look at this report that Mike Chertoff did about a year ago at I think it was Georgetown.
Right.
The distinction or the dividing line is inside the network or outside the network. Right. And yet there were some things which, like putting a beacon on your data so that it's outside your network, but it still seems very defensive. How far does your active defense go? I mean, are you really drawing the line at inside the network? That's the word you used. But can't you justify certain things that are outside the network, but that are still purely defensive?
Right, Joe, thanks. Great question. And the study, as you're referring to, which I think is George Washington.
George Washington.
The task force report.
Yes, yep.
Right. They were very concerned with any sort of invasive activity, such as hacking into a network in order to retrieve stolen data. They were keeping that outside the acceptable. They were, to my understanding, looking at more innocuous activities such as the beacons, inserting some sort of code into a document to be stolen. Somewhat like the idea, again, of deception, false files, allowing the attacker to steal those files, and so forth. So you do something as you see the attacker in the network while they're searching for your content. So they were very limited in their scale. And so what I looked at in the book was a sliding scale, starting with bogus documents, beacons, and then kind of working down a list. Somewhere in the middle is the hacking and retrieving files. Somewhere below that is doing things like using your own version of ransomware or logic bombs, kind of imposing cost, the more punishment side. And then picking scenarios in which you would allow that based on the actor you're going after. Obviously, if you're against a nation state or a very experienced, sophisticated group like one of these APTs, you better limit what you're doing if you're not the NSA. Right. And that's why I said before, limited circumstances going outside the network.
I generally dislike the term active defense. First of all, I think it's just another way of referring to defense by denial. In general, I think that typically coming from a network engineer background, I think that it's typically been let's put in IDPS systems, let's do good patching, let's do hunt teams within our networks, let's do all these different types of things. But beyond that, I think there's a fundamental problem with this notion, and that's the notion that hacking somehow emanates somewhere in someone else's network. All of the major hacks, from the Russian hacks to most of the energy grid hacks to all these other types of hacks, actually started with the individuals inside the networks themselves already. So, the DNC hack happened because somebody clicked on a link in an email, and the Ukrainian hacks happened the same way. The Stuxnet hacks happened because somebody stuck a USB drive into something. So we can build castle walls, okay? But if I walk the plague inside the castle wall, I can put all the defense mechanisms up I want, but if I walk the plague in, I'm still going to catch the disease. And I might slow the disease spread down inside the network, but a large portion of the disease is already in the network or something like that. And so I think I don't know that this is the ultimate solution. I think that there are other ways to do this, such as non-generative system development, which was pushed up by one of your colleagues at Harvard. So reducing, so your iPhone and other types of things like that are non-generative systems. They prevent you from screwing yourself. And so these types of systems are much more effective at preventing the spread of viruses and malware and other types of things. So I try and avoid silver bullet solutions because I don't think there is a silver bullet solution. IBM suggests that more than 90% of all significant hacks originated with the person essentially walking the malware into their own system.
Yeah, so usually when someone says they don't like the term active defense, there's a second term they don't like, and that's a cyber kill chain. And I see that on Twitter when someone says, I dislike active defense, cyber kill chain. So I think the idea of having a post-breach kill chain in order to defeat the activity as it's occurring on that kill chain is really what I'm alluding to in the inside defense. And again, I said before, we have to prove that really works, and I think we have a way to do that. So I want to segregate those two ideas because, as Joe brings up, they really are different, and they have merit on their own accord. We'll see.
Well, so I think there's one other issue that I didn't bring up, and that's host-based resources. So if anybody in the room, the more you increase the capability to detect malware within a particular host, the more processor resources you use, the less functional your device becomes. The higher you try and elevate that. So I have a student right now, he's working on parallel process. So for instance, your malware system only looks at around 2% of the malware coming into your system because it looks at the probabilistically most successful bits of malware at any given point in time. You can't look at all 100% because otherwise you get network latency, and then nobody wants to watch YouTube videos that take 25 minutes to load. And so I have him looking at doing parallelization of IDPS, active defense type mechanisms. But I think these are issues that have to be addressed in the future. I think that the DARPA challenge one is great because it sits off of the hosts. It sits in the perimeter, and that's great. So perimeter, but if it's going for instance, like CryptoLocker and other types of things, those are host-based threats for the most part, unless they go into hospital systems, but those are typically, a lot of them are host-based threats.
Yeah. And that's pushing the information to the cloud,
right,
which is what you're referring to, and doing the analytics there.
Yeah.
We've got about 20 minutes left, and I want to make sure that we preserve all of that for audience questions. And so I'm going to do the hardest thing I'm going to do today, which is look out into these floodlights and try to find some paddle things. So Corv, number one. Contestant number one.
So we have.
We might have number 2 over there.
Go see Mark in the front row here.
Got one over here.
This one active?
To the left.
Yeah. Who's first?
Oh, Lord.
Okay, Ben Leitzel, Army War College. I got to ask a great War College faculty question. So you all were talking about deterring bad actors from acting in cyberspace, swing the mirror around, and can we use cyber activities to deter actors in the other physical domains? What are your thoughts about that?
So I'm going to go out on a limb here. This is something that we've looked at in a war game to look at how cyber operations might. When a player thought they were sending cyber operations as a signal of deterrence, was that signal received? And if it received that signal, did it change their behaviors? And the answer is almost all of the cyber signals that people thought they were sending were never received. In general, deterrence is not elegant. Deterrence works best when it is brute and overt and highly understandable. And cyberspace, I would say one of the core characteristics of cyberspace is its uncertainty. And so using uncertainty to deter is very difficult. I think there are other influence type operations that we can use in cyberspace. But so far, I have found that it is very difficult to use cyberspace operations as an effective means of deterring operations in other domains.
Anyone else want to take a bite at that apple, or should we move on to Mark?
Thank you. Mark Thompson. Interesting discussion on norms and deterrence. And taking it apart a little bit, though, if you accept that North Korea has made it to the Final Four in terms of capabilities here, we talk about China being intertwined with our economy. Russia, not so much, but there's still other norms and deterrences there. But when you look at North Korea, none of those seem to apply, right? They're in that league. They've already demonstrated their interest and capability in doing this. I mean, Sony, obviously, not only in the hack and taking things, but the destructive nature of it. So how do we sort that out, and how does it apply to someone, an actor like North Korea? Thank you.
So let me jump in real quick. So in 2011, I ran Track 2 diplomacy with North Korea and the South Korean parliament and others. And what we found was that they were extremely rational actors. They were hyper-rational actors, and they learned very well. And if one thing that they've learned very much in recent years is that a state that doesn't have nuclear weapons is extremely susceptible to outside intervention. We demonstrated that very well in Libya. We convinced the Libyans to give up all of their nuclear weapons programs, and then the European powers essentially went in with the backing of the United States, and we destroyed the country. And so we've eliminated virtually every route of capital and development that they have, and they've resorted to the one asymmetric means by which they can receive that capital to continue the development of their state through theft, through criminal activities, and they've resorted to the one mechanism that they know they believe, and based on my conversations over robust games of ping pong, that will prevent them from being invaded, and that is the development of a nuclear weapon.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that, because that's a good segue, is that when we talk, one thing which I really haven't mentioned is motives. And Aaron just stated that, the shift from North Koreans' objectives for political stability now to political stability through acquiring cash through cyber. North Korea, you're probably aware, has been attributed to WannaCry in an attempt to raise money. They were just attributed to Lazarus Group to the Swift Bank attack in Taiwan. Used ransomware at the end to try to disguise their tracks. So North Korea has the motive. So when you're starting to ask that question about North Korea, how do you change the motive? And that motive now, as you're saying, is now raising money.
Number 3.
Yes, good afternoon. Fantastic discussion so far on the panel. And I just have a quick question. As we all know, Cybercom's going through its sort of elevation right now. They're very excited to sort of come online and do their part for the defense of the nation. And they're very interested in sort of this concept of deterring in and through cyberspace. I don't know if the language has changed, but that was sort of the really nice turn of phrase earlier. So I've heard sort of a number of different opinions on what cyber deterrence may look like or how we should frame it. How do you go about sort of helping or giving advice to a U.S. Cybercom as they go through considering how they may shape and form their cyber deterrence efforts? Thank you.
Toss up.
Well, I want Jackie to answer, but I think one of the dangers we have is that the word cyber deterrence may sometimes get in our way, because it may be that if you say,
Agreed.
how do I deter hostile acts in cyberspace, it may be that the answer is not by cyber means. And if you go back to the question that was asked earlier, can I use cyber to deter hostile acts in other domains? Maybe, but it's pretty hard because of the uncertainty she described. So the danger is that cyber deterrence as a word may confuse us a little bit.
Yeah.
Jackie, you're still on the spot.
You know, I kind of want to take the fifth because I do work with Cyber Command quite often, and they're wonderful people.
There's usually a but coming after that.
No, it's a really difficult question, especially for Cyber Command. And I think part of that is the institutional legacy of Cyber Command because it sits under Strategic Command. And so what does Strategic Command do? It does deterrence. If Cyber Command had sat under SOF or under Transcom, I don't think we would see as much of this focus on deterrence. And I think in some ways it's counterproductive because when you think of a resource as a strategic resource, then you need to hold it tightly and never let other people use it in centralized authorities. And what that's ended up doing is so far cyberspace operations have not been effective for deterrence for the reasons I previously said. But at the same time, now decision makers are so nervous about using cyberspace operations because they're strategic that they're not being used in other ways where they could be used in terms of coercion or counter cyber operations or operations that are kind of underneath the threshold of where we would think of war. So for me, I think that the Cyber Command should maybe walk back some of the deterrence initiatives so that they're more scoped and then think a lot more about using cyber operations outside of a deterrence framework.
Number two.
My name is Reagan Edens, and my question is focused really on deterrence and culture. So I think that all tribes have norms, right? And whether we write those norms down, they're implicit or explicit. And most of the time, even antagonistic tribes enforce those norms. So I find it interesting that we have, those nation-state norms, we have non-nation-state actor norms, and we have individual sort of hacking norms. And I think that when you start to think about what deterrence really means, you have to really focus at what are the tribal aspects of the way the members of the tribe see what is acceptable and what is unacceptable. And sort of, I'm thinking of a cyber version of Moscow rules, right? Where you have these implicit rules that are not to be broken, and if they are broken, the unofficial enforcement of breaking those rules is severe and quick.
I don't know what you're talking about because all you have to do is write down norms and then say them, and that's what they are.
You think that's funny? That's how we think. That's how we do norms and policy. And I think what you're saying is, I think it's great. I think you're right. I would recommend that you reach out or look for the work of Dr. Nina Collars of Franklin and Marshall, because she's actually looking at how the norms within the hacker community are formed and what that means for national security and national cyber defense. So, I think it's a great point.
Well, let me just quickly add that you can have deterrence without norms.
Yes.
If I threaten to destroy you, I don't need a norm. And you can also have norms that aren't about deterrence. And some of the most interesting norms in cyber are maybe being developed in the private sector. When Apple decided to keep its market share outside the US by telling the FBI that it would not cooperate on opening what was in the iPhone of the killer in San Bernardino, that was the development of a norm which is profoundly important to privacy. And that was done largely, that wasn't legislated by Congress, that was done by private. And when Facebook decides that it's going to hire 10,000 more censors to determine what's fake news, that's going to have something to do with what we think of as First Amendment freedoms. That's a critical norm, and it's going to be private, not legislated by Congress. So you're right, norms are important, but I can deter without norms, and there are some norms that are extremely important to our culture or our tribe that don't have much to do with deterrence.
Number one?
My question is pretty simple.
Oh God, it's the hardest.
So that's a great segue into my question, especially since we're talking about non-state actors and deterrence. What is your view on how this domain is changing the concept of the Weberian and Westphalian state?
Well, there's somebody that tweets under after Westphalia, so we'll go to him.
Aaron?
No.
You have 140 characters, Aaron.
So there's a large misconception that cyberspace is borderless. It is not a borderless place. In fact, there are the very physical, definable borders in cyberspace. The logical level of cyberspace is not even borderless either, because we're seeing data laws come down in the European Union that are structuring the ordering of the TCP/IP networks that Vint Cerf is so famous for creating that make everything work on the internet. This fundamentally changes efficiency, it changes mechanisms, it changes cost-sharing mechanisms on the backbone infrastructure of the internet, and it changes everything about how we can deter various types of activities. So changing policy at the domestic level for, say, data localization, if I require you, if I don't like intelligence coming into my country, so I make data localization laws, or I don't want my personal information being shared privately, that changes the acceptable behavior of other states coming in and breaking into my local data centers and other types of things. So policies that might seem very irrelevant to deterrence, such as data localization in Europe, can be very relevant because they can change the overall structure of the system in which deterrence operates in cyberspace. Now, in any other domain, it's not quite this. You can't say, I'm going to make a policy and then, it's a little bit different. But we can change the architecture of how things behave. One of the reasons why people were so pissed about Edward Snowden's stuff was because they found that if I was sitting in an office in Cambridge with Dave and I sent an email to him from my cell phone to his cell phone, it would go through New York, and therefore it was a legal intercept. But if you do data localization, my email stays within the territory of England in the United Kingdom. And that changes how we perceive of our sovereignty and our responsibility to our data. And so many countries around the world take sovereignty in cyberspace extremely seriously. The Chinese, the Russians, the Ukrainians now are extremely passionate about establishing sovereignty in cyberspace that has caused overwhelming, they've dropped multiple rankings in Human Rights Watch because of their data localization strategies on social media and other types of things that say that outside influencing mechanisms can't come in to their country. And so, I think it's great to say that, we're going to all sing Kumbaya and hold hands and all the borders are going to go away and we can deter people focused on criminological or other types of things. But the simple fact of the matter is that, and I taught IT 305 at West Point. We tell our cadets the first thing you want to do is you want to get from your wireless signal to a hard line as fast as possible because you increase efficiency once you get into the fiber and other types of networks. And you also lose the risk of being intercepted as well. And so sovereignty is still extremely important.
How's that for an answer?
More than 140 characters.
Sorry.
Hi, Mark Peters with MITRE. Dr. Na, you mentioned that threatening to sanction China was successful because we had a highly entangled economy. We do not have that kind of entanglement with Russia ourselves. Is there some sort of partnership or alliance we could take advantage of where the intermediary parties do have entanglement with Russia that we could impose costs kind of transitively through that alliance?
It's conceivable that we could develop such entanglement with Russia, but not very likely because the Russian exports are 2/3 energy, and the United States, since the shale revolution, has become largely not totally self-sufficient, but we're now very competitive with Russia. In other words, Russia used to use its gas for leverage, and now LNG from the U.S. is competing with them. So I don't see that there's going to be an entanglement there. What's interesting is even without economic entanglement, could you imagine an agreement with the Russians in which you say, okay, we will set limits on what the National Democratic Institute does in Moscow, and we want you to set limits on what RT and Sputnik do inside the US. Then you get into First Amendment problems of whether you could really do that. So you might have to say, okay, we will set limits on the certain covert operations that we will carry out to affect public opinion inside Russia, and we want you to limit your information warfare that you're carrying out inside the U.S. It's very hard. I mean, you could imagine rules that somebody mentioned, Moscow rules that are bargained like that, but they wouldn't really rest on the same kind of economic entanglement that affects our relations with China.
I'll add to it. We have a weird disconnect with entanglement between China and Russia, because with Russia we have substantial entanglement within our space industry and our aeronautic industries, and yet at the same time we have no economic entanglement. But with China we have enormous economic entanglement, but we exclude them from all of our space-based industries. And so, perhaps building on mutual interests in these particular areas can help develop. In fact, a lot of the ways that we've increased diplomatic ties over the last over the war on terror, particularly for overflight transit rights for supporting Afghanistan operations, is through space operations and entanglement on those particular levels.
Number one, here you go.
I'm Donna Artuzzi with the Chertoff Group, and this question is for any and all of you. I'm wondering if you can speak to how effective a deterrent or not an effective deterrent the elevation of cyber to its own domain by NATO has been or will be, and what you think would actually trigger the use of Article 5 in the cyber domain. I know the language around that has been very vague, albeit rightfully so, but your thoughts on that?
Donna, we'll find you an answer in a minute 39.
Wait, I got all excited, and then I realized you're talking about NATO.
Do what the academics do and
oh my
answer
God,
it how
we're
you
going to
want to
talk about
answer
the
it.
elevation of Cyber Command. And then you're talking about the elevation of cyber in Article 5. So I'm not really confident that we're going to get there in a credible way. And because there's so many countries that have to come together, and it's so hard for each country individually to come up with a strategy that clearly articulates what they care about in cyberspace and what is an act of war, that I'm not confident that we're going to get to that anytime soon. But I was hoping that we were going to talk about the elevation of Cyber Command, because actually the institutional growth of cyber is being used as a proxy for capabilities. And so I did a study where I looked at what the Chinese cared about over like a 4-month time period. This was back a few years ago. And one of the primary signals that they caught on and that they really cared about was the standing up or the announcement of the cyber national mission teams. And this is really fascinating because nobody actually announces what these teams do. You just say there are these people and they operate. But it's a stand-in for order of battle. And for some reason, that ends up being an idea of kind of what the balance of power is in cyberspace, which was not your question. But I'm going to do a typical academic thing and parlay it into what I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
Yeah, trying to tie a couple themes together. When we're talking about norms and we're talking about Russia, you're probably aware that on UNGEE, the government group of experts, Russia does reside, and they help to determine the norms. And one of those norms is not to attack critical infrastructure. So when you're talking about NATO and Article 5, you're going to have to ask the question, well, can you with confidence attribute that back to, say, Russia if they attack critical infrastructure, such as in Ukraine? Ukrainians blamed Russia for that. Most likely that could have been criminal actors at some phase. This whole idea of the nexus between states and hacker groups and criminals, it's going to cloud all of that, and it's going to allow deniability. So trying to figure out what rises the level of attack, well, there's some norms that might help there, but then sticking it to the certain state is going to make it even tougher. And that's a problem in deterrence.
I think invocation of Article 5 is extremely difficult to define. But I will say that and I'll pivot like Jackie did. I think that the elevation of Cyber Command and I think the creation of Cyber Command has expedited the security dilemma. And I think that that has spurred a process by which multiple other states around the world are in the process of developing their own cyber commands, which then these people are sitting in buildings and they have to do something, so they're developing exploits. And so in the process, the security dilemma gets into this widening gyre.
Well, for Aaron and Jackie, I think, treating questions like prompts is something that we should do when we reach full professor. And at our level, we should probably, no, I'm just saying that was brilliant. Thank you. We are out of time, unfortunately. So I'd like to thank our speakers, and this is a big surprise, actually.
Oh my God.
Got a couple of these glass spearheads as thank you gifts for Joe Nye, Aaron Brantley, Scott Jasper, and so we have full colonels as assistants on the stage now. And they have some dates underneath them, so
beautiful.
return them at 2 years for battery change, and don't take them out of the country. How about?
I mean, will
you
they get through
cleared these with
security?
TSA?
I know.
That's what I'm saying. We'll see how these carry on.
You could try it. So please join me in thanking our panel.